He was a decorated soldier stripped of everything but his honor, a ghost walking the frozen streets of his own city. If you believe the forgotten stories of quiet heroes deserve a voice, help us continue our mission with a super thanks. And if you stand with this soldier's dignity, leave us "Stay strong, Marcus" in the comments below. The city of Chicago wore its winter like a shroud of iron and ice. For most, it was an inconvenience, a reason to pull their scarves tighter and hurry from heated cars to heated lobbies. But for Marcus Thorne, the cold was a living thing. It was a predator that stalked the alleys and seeped through the cracked window pane of his single-room occupancy hotel, a constant gnawing presence that reminded him of everything he had lost. His life had become a study in subtractions. First, the army had taken his youth and his peace of mind, leaving him with a chest full of medals from a war in a land of sand and dust, and a head full of ghosts that paid no mind to medals. Then, his mother's illness had taken their family home, a 2-story brick house in Englewood that had held 3 generations of laughter, now just another asset liquidated by a bank. Her medical bills had been a relentless tide, and his meager pay from a security job was a wall of sand. After she was gone, the job itself was taken, a casualty of corporate restructuring, his position deemed redundant. Finally, the system itself had taken his faith. The Veterans Administration was a cold labyrinth of paperwork and indifference that denied his disability claims, for the constant ringing in his ears and the tremor that sometimes took his hands. All that remained was this room, a mattress on the floor, a hot plate, and the unshakable discipline of a soldier who refused to break. Each morning, Marcus's routine was a silent rebellion against despair. He would rise before the grey dawn, his movements precise, economical. He would fold the single thin blanket on his mattress with military corners, as if a drill sergeant might inspect it at any moment. He would heat water on the hot plate for a cup of instant coffee, the steam of fleeting warmth against his chapped face as he stood by the window, sipping the bitter liquid and watching the city wake up. He saw the world in formations and threats, a habit forged in the streets of Fallujah. He saw the patterns of traffic, the way people huddled at bus stops, the predators and the prey that moved through the urban landscape. He was no longer part of that world. He was a ghost in it, a tall, broad-shouldered black man whose presence people seemed to look right through. His dignity was his uniform now, an invisible armor he wore every day. He kept himself meticulously clean, his worn clothes patched but never dirty, his boots shined out of habit. He did not beg, he did not ask for help. He would find odd jobs, unloading a truck for a corner store, sweeping a storefront for a few dollars, enough to pay for the room and a can of soup. It was a precarious existence, a tightrope walk over an abyss of total destitution. And now the tightrope was slick with ice. The news called it a polar vortex. A tongue of Arctic air had descended upon the Midwest, plunging temperatures to levels that were not just uncomfortable, but lethal. The wind, a Chicago trademark, had become a weapon. It shrieked through the canyons of steel and glass, and it found every crack in the city's defenses. Shelters were overflowing. The city's emergency services were stretched to their breaking point. For Marcus, the cold was a physical weight. It made the ache in his old shrapnel wound deeper, a dull throb in his thigh that was a constant, unwelcome companion. He spent his days in the public library, not reading, but simply absorbing the warmth, staying until the security guards politely asked everyone to leave at closing time. Then came the long walk back to his SRO, a gauntlet he ran against the encroaching frostbite. It was on one such evening, with the temperature plummeting into the negative double digits and the wind chill making it feel like 40 below, that he saw them. They were huddled in the recessed doorway of a shuttered pawn shop, a small knot of misery against the unforgiving brick. 4 women. One was elderly, her face a mask of weary resolve, her thin frame wrapped in a coat that was little more than rags held together by hope. The other 3 were younger, their ages hard to guess beneath the grime and fear, all of them shivering violently, their bodies pressed together in a desperate, failing search for warmth. Marcus had seen suffering. He had seen it in the eyes of starving children in Iraq. hierarch and in the haunted faces of his fellow soldiers. But this was different. This was here, on his street, in his city that pretended to be a beacon of civilization. He saw the way the wind tore at their thin layers of clothing. He saw the bluish tint on the lips of the youngest-looking one. He saw the resignation in the old woman's eyes, the look of someone who had fought and was now preparing for the final surrender. People hurried past them, their faces buried in their collars, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The women were as invisible as he was. He stopped. His training screamed at him to keep moving, to conserve his own energy, his own body heat. Survival was a selfish calculus. He had exactly 1 can of chili in his room. He had just enough warmth for one body. Taking them in was not just an inconvenience, it was a profound risk. To his finances, to his safety, to his own precarious hold on survival. The building manager, a sour man named Mr. Henderson, was a hawk who patrolled the hallways, and extra tenants, even for a single night, meant instant eviction. He stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping at him, his own body starting to tremble not just from the cold, but from the weight of the choice. He looked at their faces again, and in the old woman's gaze, he saw his own mother in her final days, the same fierce, stubborn pride battling against a failing body. The soldier in him, the man who was trained to run toward the sound of trouble, to protect the vulnerable, made the decision. His own survival was secondary to the mission, and the mission was clear. He walked over to them, his large frame casting a shadow that momentarily blocked the biting wind. The younger women flinched, pulling closer together, but the matriarch looked up. Her eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, were sharp and assessing. She was not afraid. She was weighing him. "You can't stay here," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You'll be dead by morning." He didn't offer pity. He offered a statement of fact, the kind of brutal honesty one soldier gives another in the field. The old woman's chin lifted a fraction. "And where would you have us go, sir? The inns are all full." Her voice was hoarse, but carried a strange, formal cadence, a ghost of an accent he couldn't quite place. It was the voice of a queen dressed in rags, a detail so incongruous he almost missed it. Marcus ignored the oddness of her speech, focusing on the mission. "With me," he said simply, "it's not much, but it's warm. It's out of this wind." He didn't wait for an argument or an acceptance. He turned and started walking toward his building, a slow, deliberate pace, trusting they would follow. For a moment, they remained frozen, a tableau of disbelief and suspicion. Then the old woman struggled to her feet, her joints protesting with audible cracks. She pulled the others up with her, her authority unspoken but absolute. With stumbling, painful steps, the 4 women followed the tall, silent soldier into the relative shelter of the narrow street, leaving the howling wind of the main thoroughfare behind. They followed him toward a broken-down door and a flight of dark, creaking stairs, having no idea that they were walking away from one kind of death and into a story that would change all of their lives, and his, forever. The climb up the 3 flights of stairs was a slow, agonizing procession. The hallway was barely lit by a single fly-specked bulb on each landing, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like wraiths. The air was thick with the smell of stale cooking oil, damp plaster, and a general aura of defeat. Each creak of the floorboards under Marcus's weight sounded like a gunshot in the near-silent building. He moved with a practiced stealth, placing his feet carefully, his body a study in controlled tension. Behind him, the 4 women followed, their progress marked by ragged breathing and the rustle of their thin clothing. The youngest one stumbled, and one of the others caught her, a quiet murmur of encouragement passing between them. They were a unit, a tight-knit fire team moving through hostile territory. Marcus paused at the top of the final flight, listening. He heard the muffled sound of a television from one room, the distant wail of a siren from the street below, and the incessant moaning of the wind against the building. Satisfied, he proceeded to the last door on the left, number 313. The key in the lock made a grating sound that seemed to echo down the hall. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, holding it for them to enter. The room was not a space, it was a container. It held a man's entire life within 4 peeling walls. The first thing that struck the women was not the poverty, but the order. On the floor in one corner lay a thin mattress, its single grey blanket folded with geometric precision. Next to it, a small wooden crate served as a nightstand, holding a worn Bible and a small framed photograph of a smiling, kind-faced woman. A hot plate sat on another crate, beside a single pot and a tin mug. His few clothes were hung neatly on a series of nails hammered into the wall. The room was bare, almost monastic, but it was immaculately clean. There was no clutter, no filth, no sign of the chaos that usually accompanies such desperate living. It was the cell of a monk or the barracks of a soldier. The only source of heat was a large cast-iron radiator under the window, which hissed and clanked erratically, giving off a dry, inconsistent warmth. It was a meager defense against the Arctic assault outside, but after hours in the wind, it felt like a roaring hearth. The women shuffled in, their eyes taking in every detail, their expressions a mixture of relief, apprehension, and profound surprise. They had expected a hovel. They had found a sanctuary, however humble. Marcus closed the door behind them, the click of the latch sounding unnervingly loud. He put a finger to his lips, a silent command for quiet, his gaze flicking toward the thin wall he shared with his neighbor. "Mr. Henderson, the manager," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He walks the halls. He doesn't like guests." The implication was clear. Discovery meant eviction. For him, it meant being thrown back out into the very cold from which he had just rescued them. For them, it meant the same. They were all in this together now. The matriarch, Eleanor, gave a slow, deliberate nod. She understood chain of command. She understood the need for discipline. She gestured to the younger women, who immediately fell silent, their shivering the only sound they made. Marcus moved with purpose. He pointed to the small space near the radiator. "Sit there, get warm." He then went to his small collection of cans on a makeshift shelf. He took down the single can of chili. It was his meal for the next 2 days. Without hesitation, he took out a can opener and opened it. He poured the contents into his one pot and placed it on the hot plate, which began to glow a dull orange. The women watched him, huddled together. The youngest one, who looked barely out of her teens, had a cut on her hand that was red and inflamed. The oldest woman, Eleanor, had a racking cough that she tried to stifle into a threadbare scarf. They were not just cold, they were unwell. As the chili began to bubble, a savory aroma filled the small room, a smell so rich and inviting it was almost painful. It was the scent of life, of sustenance. Marcus found 4 plastic spoons he had saved and washed from a takeout place. When the chili was hot, he carefully divided it into 4 portions, using the lid of the can and a couple of old plastic containers he kept for just such purposes. He handed one to each of them. The younger women took them with trembling hands, their eyes wide with gratitude. Eleanor accepted hers with a quiet, "Thank you, sir." It was a formal, almost regal acknowledgement. She looked at him, then at the empty pot. "Will you not be joining us?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "I ate earlier," Marcus lied without blinking. It was a field lie, a necessary untruth to ensure the welfare of others. He wasn't hungry. The mission came first. He turned away and filled his tin mug with water from a plastic jug, his back to them, so they wouldn't see the truth in his eyes. He ate his lies while they ate his food. The silence in the room broken only by the sound of spoons scraping against plastic and the hissing of the radiator. He watched them out of the corner of his eye, assessing their condition. The youngest one, Clara, was clearly suffering from the early stages of frostnip. Her fingers and nose a waxy white. When they were finished, he took the empty containers. He then opened a small footlocker at the base of his makeshift closet. It was his past, his entire military history condensed into one box. He bypassed the medals, the letters, the memories. He went straight for the field medical kit. It was old, but the supplies were still good. He pulled out a tube of antiseptic ointment and some clean gauze. He walked over to the young woman. "Let me see your hand," he said, his voice gentle but firm. She flinched, but Eleanor gave her a slight nod, and she hesitantly held it out. With the practiced hands of a man who had dressed wounds under fire, Marcus cleaned the cut, applied the ointment, and wrapped it neatly. He worked with an impersonal efficiency that was more comforting than any effusive sympathy. He then looked at her face. "Your nose and ears. You need to rub them gently. Get the circulation back." He did the same for the other two younger women, checking their hands and faces, giving quiet, clear instructions. He was their medic, their commanding officer, their shield. The final, most difficult logistical problem was sleeping. There was one mattress, one blanket, 5 people. For Marcus, the solution was obvious and non-negotiable. "You four take the mattress," he stated, not offering it as a choice. "It's not much, but it's off the floor." The women looked at each other, then at the bare floorboards where he would have to sleep. One of the others, a woman with haunted, intelligent eyes named Amelia, spoke up. "But where will you sleep?" "I'll be fine," Marcus said, the words a period at the end of a sentence. He took his old army field jacket from its nail on the wall. It was worn and faded, but it was thick. That would be his bed, that and the floor. He laid the single blanket over them as they crammed together on the mattress, a tangle of limbs seeking shared warmth. He then retreated to the far wall, near the door, and sat with his back against it, pulling the jacket tight around himself. He wouldn't sleep. He would stand watch. It was what he was trained to do. He sat in the dim light, a silent sentinel, his body aching with cold and hunger, his mind a quiet hum of alertness. The radiator clanked and hissed, a metallic beast breathing fitfully in the corner. Outside, the wind howled its mournful song. In the relative quiet of the room, he could finally feel the full weight of his exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man fighting a war on too many fronts. He thought they were all asleep. But as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw that the old woman, Eleanor, was watching him. Her eyes gleamed in the faint light filtering through the grimy window. She wasn't just looking at him, she was studying him. She saw the rigid posture, the way his head stayed up, never slumping in sleep. She saw the discipline that held his exhausted body erect. She saw the profound, almost painful dignity in his every quiet action. She had spent a lifetime judging men of power and wealth, men who commanded armies and built empires. She knew their bluster, their ambition, their vanities. And in this tiny, freezing room, in this poor, forgotten soldier who had given them his last meal and his only bed, she saw a quality of character that would have shamed them all. He had offered them shelter without asking their names. He had tended their wounds without asking their story. He had protected them without asking for anything in return. He thought he was giving refuge to 4 beggars. He had no way of knowing that he was being weighed and measured by 4 of the most powerful women in the world, and that in their silent, unforgiving judgment, he was being found worthy. The night stretched on, a long, dark corridor of time. For Marcus, it was a familiar state of being. He had spent countless nights like this in the desert, on watch, every sense tuned to the faintest sound, the slightest movement in the shadows. Here, the enemy wasn't an insurgent with a rifle. It was the cold, the manager, the gnawing hunger in his belly, and the ghosts that always came visiting in the quiet hours. He sat propped against the wall, the worn floorboards a cold reminder of his sacrifice. The field jacket provided a meager defense, but the chill seeped in relentlessly, working its way into his bones. He could hear the shallow, rattling breaths of the old woman, Eleanor, and the occasional whimper from Clara, the youngest, as she shifted in a troubled sleep. He didn't allow himself the luxury of rest. His mind cycled through the litany of his failures, the VA. Paperwork he must have filled out wrong, the job interview where he'd been too quiet, the moment he should have sold the house sooner to give his mother more comfort. These were the shrapnel fragments lodged in his soul, and they ached more than the piece of metal in his thigh. He was a man trained to solve problems with direct action, yet he was trapped in a life where the enemies were intangible: bureaucracy, economic shifts, the slow erosion of hope. Protecting these women, however, was a tangible mission. It had a clear objective: get them through the night. It grounded him, giving him a purpose that had been absent for too long. As the first hint of a bruised grey dawn began to lighten the sky, Eleanor stirred. She sat up slowly, her movements stiff and pained. her eyes, clear and sharp despite her condition, found Marcus in the dim light. He hadn't moved. He was still sitting upright, a statue of vigilance carved from exhaustion. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the faint tremor in his hands he tried to still by clenching them into fists. A quiet, unspoken communication passed between them. She acknowledged his sacrifice with a slow, regal dip of her head. He acknowledged her awareness with a barely perceptible nod. The other women began to wake, groaning softly, stiff from the cold and the cramped quarters. The reality of their situation returned with the morning light. They were still homeless, still in danger, but they had survived the night. The immediate threat had been neutralized thanks to the stranger who now looked as worn and weathered as they did. The room was colder now. The old radiator had given up its fight sometime in the early morning and was now just a cold lump of iron. Marcus rose to his feet, his joints protesting. Every muscle screamed from the cold and the rigid posture he had maintained all night. He ignored it, his movements still economical and precise. He went to the window and scraped a small patch of frost from the pane. The street below was deserted, blanketed in a fresh layer of snow that had fallen overnight. The wind had died down, but the air held a crystalline, biting stillness that promised another day of brutal cold. "You need to stay here until the libraries or the warming centers open," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It's too dangerous to be out there this early. Henderson usually leaves around 8. We'll wait for him to go." He was thinking tactically, planning their exfiltration. The women nodded, their trust in his judgment absolute. He turned to his meager pantry. There was nothing left but a half-empty jar of instant coffee and a few sugar packets. He heated a pot of water on the hot plate, the glowing orange coil a welcome spot of color in the grey room. He poured the steaming water into his tin mug and the empty chili containers, making 4 weak, unsweetened black coffees. He handed one to each of them. It wasn't food, but it was hot. It was a gesture of communion. As they sipped the coffee, a fragile sense of normalcy settled over the room. The initial shock and desperation had receded, replaced by a quiet curiosity. Amelia, the woman with the intelligent, haunted eyes, was the first to break the silence that had shrouded their identities. "My name is Amelia," she said, her voice soft but clear. "This is Clara," she gestured to the youngest, "and Beatrice." She indicated the 4th woman, who had remained mostly silent, her face a stoic mask. "And this is Eleanor Vance." The name was said with a certain emphasis, as if it should mean something. To Marcus, it was just a name. He simply nodded. "Marcus Thorne," he replied. No rank, no history, just his name. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze piercing. "You were a soldier, Mr. Thorne." It wasn't a question. "I was," he confirmed, offering no further detail. "It shows," she said, a world of meaning in those 2 words. "In your discipline, in your honor." The word hung in the air, a foreign concept in this room defined by its lack of everything. Marcus felt a flush of discomfort. He wasn't used to praise. He simply did what was required. The conversation once started flowed hesitantly. They didn't speak of how they had ended up on the street. It was a tacit understanding among the displaced that you don't ask about the fall. You only deal with the landing. Instead, they spoke of small things. Beatrice, it turned out, had a dry, surprising wit, making a quiet joke about the coffee that drew weak smiles from the others. Clara spoke about a dog she once had, her voice full of a youthful sadness. Amelia watched everything, her eyes missing no detail. The way Marcus instinctively positioned himself between them and the door, the frayed but perfectly knotted laces on his boots, the worn photograph of his mother by his bed. She was an observer, a chronicler of details. And Eleanor guided the conversation with a gentle but firm hand, asking Marcus about the neighborhood, the library hours, the best routes to the nearest clinic. Her questions were practical, strategic. She was gathering intelligence, mapping the terrain of their new, temporary reality. At a few minutes past 8, Marcus moved to the door and listened intently. He heard the familiar heavy tread of Mr. Henderson descending the stairs, followed by the slam of the front entrance door. "He's gone," he announced. "We have a window. The library opens at 9. It's a 10-minute walk from here. It's the warmest, safest place." He laid out the plan like a mission briefing. He then did something that surprised them all. He went to his footlocker again and pulled out a few items: a thick pair of wool socks, a spare watch cap, and a pair of worn leather gloves. He handed the socks to Clara. "Put these on over yours. They're too big, but they'll add a layer." He gave the cap to Beatrice and the gloves to Amelia. He had nothing left for Eleanor. He looked at his own hands, then at hers, which were blue and wrinkled. He began to take off the thin gloves he himself was wearing. Eleanor held up a hand, stopping him. "No, Mr. Thorne. A commander must not strip his own defenses. We are grateful enough." Her authority was absolute. He reluctantly kept his gloves on. Before they left, he took the last of his cash, $17 and some change, from a small tin. He pressed it into Eleanor's hand. "For food, a coffee and a bagel for each of you. Something hot." Eleanor looked at the crumpled bills in her palm. It was, she knew, everything he had in the world. He was giving them his clothes, his food, his money, his safety. She looked up at him, and for the first time, the iron mask of her composure seemed to crack. Her eyes glistened with an emotion he couldn't decipher. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something akin to awe. "The world believes men like you no longer exist, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "They are wrong." Marcus just shook his head, embarrassed. "Everyone needs a hand sometimes," he mumbled, turning away to open the door. He escorted them down the stairs and to the front entrance, checking the street like a point man before letting them step outside. He gave them clear directions to the library. "Stay together. Stay in the light. Don't talk to strangers." The words were an echo of every parent, every protector. As they stood on the icy sidewalk, preparing to merge back into the anonymous flow of the city, Amelia turned back to him. "Will we see you again?" she asked. The question held a genuine weight. In less than 12 hours, he had become their anchor. Marcus looked at the four women, their faces pinched with cold, their futures utterly uncertain. "I'll be at the library this afternoon," he said. "Third floor, reference section. It's quiet there." It was a promise, a rendezvous point. He watched them walk away, a small, ragged flock moving with a new, shared purpose, until they turned the corner and were gone. He then turned back to his empty room, to the cold, the silence, and the gnawing hunger that was now his only companion. He had completed the mission. He had gotten them through the night. He had no idea he had just set in motion the first stage of an operation that would shatter his world. The library was a palace of warmth and silence. For the city's forgotten population, it was more than a repository of books. It was a haven. Marcus arrived in the early afternoon, the gnawing in his stomach having subsided into a dull, persistent ache he was long accustomed to ignoring. His priority was not food, but intel and observation. He needed to ensure the women were safe. He found them exactly where he had told them to be, in the vast, quiet reading room of the third-floor reference section. They had claimed a large, circular table in a far corner, partially shielded from view by towering shelves of legal statutes and historical archives. They didn't look like beggars anymore. The hours in the heated building had brought color back to their faces. Their shivering had stopped. Clara was asleep, her head resting on her arms, the clean white gauze on her hand a stark contrast to her grimy coat. Beatrice was leafing through a large picture book of architecture, a small, wistful smile on her face. Amelia was writing furiously in a small, tattered notebook with a pencil stub, her brow furrowed in concentration. And Eleanor. Eleanor was not reading. She was watching the room, her posture as straight and alert as a general's in her command tent. She saw Marcus the moment he entered the section, her eyes locking with his across the cavernous space. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Mission accomplished. The package was secure. Marcus didn't join them. It would draw too much attention. Instead, he took a seat at a carrel a few aisles away, a position that gave him a clear line of sight to their table, while allowing him to appear engrossed in a thick, unread volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica. He was running counter-surveillance. He watched the other people drifting through the reference section, students hunched over laptops, elderly men reading newspapers, other homeless individuals seeking refuge, their belongings stuffed into plastic bags. He noted the slow, rhythmic patrol of the library security guard. He mapped the exits. It was second nature, a series of calculations his mind performed automatically. For a few hours, there was a strange, peaceful routine. The women were safe. He was warm. The quiet of the library was a soothing balm on his frayed nerves. But Marcus knew this was just a lull in the storm. The library would close at 9. The temperature outside was dropping again as the sun began its descent. The temporary truce would end, and the battle for survival would resume. He had no more food, no more money. He had given it all away. He had no plan for the coming night, for them or for himself. Around 5 o'clock, Eleanor rose from the table. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, her back ramrod straight, and made her way to a bank of payphones near the library's entrance. Marcus watched her, his curiosity piqued. A payphone was an anachronism, a relic from a past era. Who could she possibly be calling? From his vantage point, he couldn't hear her words, but he could see her demeanor. She put a coin in the slot, dialed a number with unerring precision, and began to speak. Her conversation was brief, no more than 2 minutes, but her entire bearing changed. As she spoke, the weariness seemed to fall away from her. She stood straighter, her gestures were sharp and decisive, her expression one of absolute command. It was the same authority he had seen in his own commanding officers, a natural assumption of power that needed no uniform or title to be recognized. She hung up the phone and stood for a moment, her eyes closed as if gathering her strength. Then she returned to the table, her face once again an impassive mask. But Marcus had seen it. He had seen the queen emerge from behind the beggar's disguise. An uneasy feeling began to prickle at the back of his mind. These were not ordinary women. An hour later, a man entered the library. He was conspicuously out of place. While everyone else was dressed in layers of winter clothing, he wore a tailored black suit over a crisp white shirt with no overcoat despite the Arctic temperatures outside. He was tall, impeccably groomed, with a military-style haircut and an earpiece that was just barely visible. He moved with the silent, efficient grace of a predator, his eyes scanning the cavernous room not with a reader's curiosity, but with a professional's threat assessment. He walked directly toward the reference section. Marcus's instincts screamed. This man was a professional, police, federal agent, private security. His posture tensed, his body prepared for conflict. The man's eyes swept past Marcus without a flicker of recognition and settled on the women's table. He walked directly to Eleanor. He stopped a respectful distance away and bowed his head slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, deferential rumble, "the vehicle is ready." Eleanor looked up at him. "Thank you, Arthur. Is everything arranged as I instructed?" "Everything," the man, Arthur, confirmed. "And the other matter?" Eleanor asked, her voice dropping even lower. "Resolved," Arthur said. "The transaction is complete. The titles have been cleared and registered in the new name." The other 3 women were now awake and alert. They gathered their meager belongings with a practiced speed. Arthur stepped forward and gently took the plastic bag of items from Eleanor's hand, holding it as if it were a priceless antique. The entire interaction was surreal. It was a scene from a spy movie playing out in the quiet of the public library. Amelia, Clara, and Beatrice rose and stood behind Eleanor, falling into a formation of deference. They were no longer a huddle of equals, they were a retinue. Eleanor turned, and her eyes found Marcus, who was now standing, his body a rigid line of confusion and suspicion. She walked toward him, her entourage following a few paces behind. Arthur's eyes were now fixed on Marcus, his expression neutral, but his posture radiating a quiet lethality. He had assessed Marcus as a potential threat and was ready to neutralize him. Eleanor stopped in front of Marcus. She looked frail and small next to his powerful frame, yet she commanded the space between them completely. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice now clear and strong, devoid of the hoarseness of the previous night, "it seems our time as vagrants has come to an end." Marcus was speechless. His mind was racing, trying to process the impossible scene. The tailored suit, the talk of vehicles and transactions, the sudden transformation from desperate mendicants to, what? Who were these people? I don't understand, he stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. You will, Eleanor said. A faint, enigmatic smile touched her lips. A car is waiting to take us to our hotel. I have taken the liberty of securing a room for you as well. For the week, she held out a small, crisp white envelope. This is for your trouble. A more formal expression of our gratitude will follow. Marcus looked at the envelope, then back at her face. He didn't reach for it. I don't want your money, he said, his voice flat. His pride, the last currency he possessed, was stinging. Had this been a game, a test? It is not charity, Mr. Thorne. It is compensation, Eleanor stated calmly. You rendered a service of incalculable value. It is our custom to pay our debts. He was still struggling to comprehend the situation. Who are you? He asked, the question blunt. Eleanor's smile widened slightly. We are 4 women whom you saved from freezing to death. That is all you need to know for now. She pushed the envelope into the pocket of his field jacket. Arthur will escort you. The Fairmont Hotel. A suite has been reserved in your name. With that, she turned and walked away, her 3 companions and her formidable protector falling into step behind her. They moved through the library like royalty departing a function, the other patrons barely looking up from their books, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. Marcus stood frozen, his hand on the envelope in his pocket. He could feel the impossible thickness of it. He watched them leave, a silent, powerful procession disappearing down the grand staircase. The Fairmont Hotel. It was one of the most exclusive, expensive hotels in the city, a place he had only ever seen from the outside, a glittering palace for a class of people whose lives were as alien to him as those of astronauts. He was a soldier, trained for clarity, for identifiable friend and foe, for clear objectives. He was now in the middle of a scenario for which he had no training, no context. He pulled the envelope from his pocket. It was heavy, thick linen paper with no markings. He opened the flap. Inside was not a check or a voucher. It was a stack of $100 bills, held together by a simple paperclip. He thumbed through them quickly, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was thousands of dollars, more money than he had seen in one place in his entire life. He looked around the quiet library, at the faded books and the weary faces. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis and he was sliding off the edge. Walking out of the library was like stepping from one reality into another. The biting cold of the Chicago evening felt sharper, the city lights harsher. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, suspicion, and a dizzying sense of vertigo. In his pocket, the thick stack of bills felt like a burning coal, a foreign object that didn't belong in his world. Outside the grand stone entrance of the library, a gleaming black town car was idling at the curb, its engine a low, purring hum. Arthur, the man in the suit, stood holding the rear door open. He nodded at Marcus, his expression unreadable. This was a world of quiet efficiency and unspoken commands, a world utterly alien to Marcus's life of shouting sergeants and desperate want. Getting into the car felt like a surrender. The plush leather seat sank under his weight, and the door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing him off from the sounds of the street. The interior of the car smelled of wealth, a subtle blend of polished wood, expensive leather and clean, filtered air. The sudden silence was more jarring than the city noise. Arthur got into the passenger seat, and the driver, another man in a dark suit, pulled the car smoothly into traffic. No one spoke. Marcus stared out the window at the familiar, gritty streets of his city, but they looked different from this vantage point. He was an observer behind bulletproof glass, insulated from the cold, the dirt, the desperation he knew so intimately. He saw a man huddled in a doorway, clutching a thin blanket, and felt a sharp pang of guilt. 24 hours ago, that had been his world. Now he was being chauffeured to a luxury hotel with a pocket full of cash. It felt like a betrayal. He looked at the back of Arthur's head, at the disciplined line of his neck. "Who is she?" Marcus asked again, his voice filling the silent car. Arthur didn't turn around. He simply looked into the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "She is my employer, Mr. Thorne," he said, his tone polite but firm, offering information that conveyed nothing, "and she values her privacy." The message was clear. Questions were not welcome. The Fairmont Hotel was a beacon of gold and light against the dark winter sky. A uniformed doorman rushed to open the car door, his face a mask of professional courtesy. Marcus stepped out, feeling intensely self-conscious. His worn field jacket, patched jeans, and scuffed boots were a stark contrast to the opulence around him. He could feel the eyes of the hotel staff on him, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. He was an anomaly, a piece that didn't fit. But then Arthur was at his side, murmuring something to the doorman, and the man's expression immediately shifted to one of impeccable deference. "Welcome, Mr. Thorne," he said, holding the heavy glass door open. The lobby was a breathtaking cavern of marble, crystal and polished brass. A massive chandelier, like a frozen waterfall of light, hung from the ceiling. The air was warm and smelled faintly of expensive perfume and fresh flowers. People in designer clothes and expensive jewelry drifted across the plush carpets, their voices a low, confident murmur. Marcus felt like he was trespassing in a palace. He had never felt more out of place in his life, not even as a black soldier in a forgotten corner of a foreign war. Arthur led him to the front desk. "Reservation for Thorne," he said to the clerk, who was already smiling, having clearly been briefed. "Of course, sir. The presidential suite. We have everything ready for you." The clerk slid a sleek keycard across the polished counter. "Presidential suite." The words sounded absurd, like a line from a movie. Arthur took the keycard. "Your luggage will be taken care of," he said to Marcus. Marcus looked down at his empty hands. Luggage. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back and the contents of a single footlocker in a room he might never return to. "I don't have any luggage," Marcus stated flatly. Arthur didn't miss a beat. "Of course, an oversight. It will be rectified. Enjoy your stay, Mr. Thorne. Someone will be in contact tomorrow." And with that he turned and walked away, disappearing as silently and efficiently as he had appeared. Marcus was left alone, standing in the center of the opulent lobby, holding a key card to a life that wasn't his. A bellhop, a young man with a polite but nervous smile, materialized at his side. "Mr. Thorne, I can show you to your suite." Marcus followed him to a private elevator, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. The suite was on the top floor. The keycard beeped, and the door swung open onto a space larger than the entire floor of his SRO building. A vast living room with floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. A plush, white sofa faced a fireplace where a gas fire was already flickering merrily. There was a dining area with a polished mahogany table, a small kitchen stocked with gleaming appliances, and a hallway leading to what he assumed was the bedroom. It was a world of sterile, impersonal luxury. It was beautiful, but it had no soul. There was no worn Bible on the nightstand, no faded photograph of his mother. The bellhop showed him the features of the suite, the thermostat, the entertainment system, the bar stocked with bottles of liquor that cost more than his monthly rent. Marcus gave the young man a $20 bill from the wad in his pocket. The bellhop's eyes widened. "Thank you, sir. Thank you. If you need anything at all, just press this button." He pointed to an intercom system and then backed out of the room, leaving Marcus alone in the cavernous silence. He walked through the suite as if it were an enemy compound he was clearing, his boots sinking into the thick white carpet. He touched the smooth, cold marble of the fireplace, the soft fabric of the sofa. In the bedroom, a king-sized bed with a mountain of pillows dominated the space. The adjoining bathroom was a temple of chrome and granite, with a walk-in shower that had multiple shower heads and a bathtub the size of a small boat. On the vanity, an array of expensive soaps and lotions were laid out. He looked at his reflection in the vast mirror. He saw a tired, broke, homeless soldier in a room designed for kings and titans of industry. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. He felt a sudden, powerful wave of anger. This was a joke, a cruel, elaborate prank. bank. These women, whoever they were playing with him. They had observed his poverty, his desperation, and were now amusing themselves by seeing how the lowly animal would behave in a gilded cage. He felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the same feeling he'd had when the VA officer had looked at his file and told him his hearing loss wasn't service-related, or when the bank manager had spoken to him in condescendingly simple terms as he signed away his mother's house. He walked back into the living room, his fists clenched. His instinct was to run, to take the money, go back to his SRO, and disappear, forget he ever saw them. But the soldier in him, the man who never left a mission unfinished, rebelled against the idea. He didn't have all the intel. He didn't understand the objective. Retreating now would be a failure. He had to understand who these women were and what they wanted from him. His stomach rumbled violently, a raw, painful reminder that he hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. He saw a menu on the dining table, 24-hour in-room dining. He picked it up. The prices were astronomical. A cheeseburger was $40. A steak was over $100. He could eat for a month on the price of one meal. But he had thousands of dollars of their money in his pocket. He picked up the phone. He ordered the cheeseburger, a bowl of soup, and a pot of coffee. He would use their resources. He would resupply, and then he would figure out his next move. While he waited, he stripped off his clothes and took a shower. The hot water was a miracle, washing away the grime and the cold that had clung to him for so long. It was the first truly hot shower he'd had in years. As the steam filled the bathroom, it felt like it was melting away a layer of armor, leaving him feeling raw and vulnerable. For the first time, the full weight of his exhaustion hit him, not just the fatigue of the last 48 hours, but the deep, soul-crushing weariness of his entire life since coming home from the war. He stood under the pounding water for a long time, letting the heat soak into his aching muscles, and for the first time in a very long time, he let his guard down and simply felt. The food arrived under a polished silver cloche, delivered by the same nervous bellhop. When Marcus lifted the lid, the aroma that billowed out was so rich and deeply satisfying that it made his head swim for a moment. It wasn't just a cheeseburger, it was an icon of one. A thick, perfectly grilled patty of rich beef, draped in melted aged cheddar, resting on a toasted brioche bun with crisp lettuce and a slice of ripe tomato. The tomato soup was a velvety, deep red bisque, steaming in a porcelain bowl. The coffee was black, strong and fragrant. He sat at the enormous dining table, a lone diner in a banquet hall, and ate. He did not devour the food like a starving man. He ate slowly, deliberately, with the same focused precision he applied to everything. He was field stripping a weapon, cleaning a wound, sighting a target. Each bite was a victory. Each sip of hot coffee was a reinforcement. The warmth spread from his stomach through his entire body, chasing away the deep, cellular cold that had been his constant companion for years. It was more than sustenance. It was a restoration. He was reclaiming a part of himself that had been eroded by hunger and want. He had just finished the last of his coffee when a soft chime sounded from the door. He tensed, his brief moment of peace shattered. He stood and moved toward the door, his steps silent on the thick carpet. He looked through the peephole. It was not Arthur, nor any of the women. It was a hotel employee standing beside a large mobile garment rack, the kind used for transporting wardrobes, laden with clothing bags from what were clearly expensive stores. Behind him stood another employee with a stack of elegant-looking shopping bags and shoe boxes. Marcus opened the door. "Delivery for Mr. Thorne," the man said with a practiced smile. "Compliments of the hotel." Marcus knew it wasn't from the hotel. This was Arthur's rectification. He stepped aside and let them in. They wheeled the garment rack into the massive walk-in closet in the bedroom and arranged the bags and boxes neatly on a bench. The sheer volume was staggering. There were at least 5 suits in different shades of grey and navy, a dozen dress shirts, cashmere sweaters, wool trousers, casual shirts, and a heavy, beautifully tailored black wool wool overcoat that probably cost more than his mother's first car. The boxes contained several pairs of leather shoes, dress shoes, boots, casual loafers. It was an entire wardrobe, a new life curated and delivered in under an hour. After the employees left, Marcus stood in the closet, surrounded by the silent, imposing presence of the new clothes. The smell of new wool and fresh leather was thick in the air. His first, overwhelming instinct was rejection. It was a costume, an insult. They were dressing him up like a doll, trying to paper over the rough, broken man he was, with a veneer of wealth and respectability. He reached out and touched the sleeve of a charcoal grey suit. The fabric was impossibly soft. This was not a uniform. A uniform, he understood. It was a tool, a symbol of a shared identity, a piece of equipment you wore to do a job. This was something else. This felt like an attempt to erase him, to replace Marcus Thorne, the broke, forgotten soldier from Englewood, with a polished stranger who belonged in places like this. He felt a surge of the same anger he'd felt earlier. He would not be their project, their pet. He would wear his own worn clothes, his own broken-in boots. They were his history, his scars. They were real. He turned to leave the closet to ignore the mountain of expensive fabric when he saw a small, cream-colored envelope resting on top of one of the shoeboxes. It was made of the same heavy linen paper as the one that had held the cash. His name, Mr. Thorne, was written on the front in elegant feminine script. He opened it. The note inside was brief, written on a matching card. A soldier is only as effective as his equipment. In this new terrain, your old uniform would make you a target. Consider these tools, nothing more. They are camouflage, designed to allow you to move through the environment without attracting unwanted attention. Use them as you see fit. E.V. He read the note twice. Eleanor Vance, E.V. The words were chosen with surgical precision. She hadn't called it a gift. She hadn't mentioned gratitude or charity. She had framed it in the only language she knew he would understand, the language of a mission, tools, camouflage, terrain, target. She wasn't pitying him. She was arming him. She wasn't trying to change who he was. She was giving him the means to operate in her world. It was a gesture of profound, strategic intelligence. It acknowledged his past, respected his mindset, and bypassed his pride completely. He stood there for a long time, the card in his hand, the anger inside him slowly giving way to a grudging respect. She was formidable. She understood power, and she understood him in a way that was both unnerving and deeply impressive. He was a pawn on a board he didn't understand, but she, at least, was acknowledging that he was a pawn with a specific set of skills. She wasn't just moving him, she was equipping him for the move. A choice was before him. He could cling to his pride, wrap himself in the righteous tatters of his old life, and walk out of this gilded cage. Or he could accept the camouflage. He could put on the enemy's uniform to walk among them, to learn their secrets, to understand the rules of this new war. It was an infiltration. Seen that way, it was no longer a humiliation, it was a tactical necessity. If Marcus's stubborn resolve to maintain his dignity, even when faced with unimaginable power, has touched your heart, a super thanks is the most direct way to help us continue honoring souls like his. His strength is a testament to the unbreakable human spirit we strive to celebrate. He made his decision. He stripped off his old clothes, folded them neatly, and placed them in one of the empty shopping bags. He would not throw them away. They were a reminder of who he was and where he came from. Then he began to dress. He chose a pair of dark grey wool trousers, a simple white shirt, and a soft navy blue cashmere sweater. The clothes fit perfectly, as if they had been tailored for him. He slipped his feet into a pair of supple leather boots that felt like they were made for his feet. He walked back to the large mirror in the bathroom and looked at his reflection. The man looking back at him was a stranger. The familiar silhouette of a struggling veteran was gone, replaced by someone who looked powerful. The clothes didn't make him a different person, but they changed the way the world would see him. They were indeed a form of armor, a shield against the casual contempt the world reserved for the poor. He looked like he belonged here, and in that there was a strange, unsettling power. Just as he was processing this transformation, the phone on the bedside table rang, its tone a polite, unobtrusive chime. He walked over and picked it up. "Thorne," he said, his voice steady. "Mr. Thorne," came the calm, professional voice of Arthur. "I trust your accommodations are satisfactory." "They're fine," Marcus said, unwilling to give the man the satisfaction of an effusive response. "Good," Arthur said. "Ms. Vance would like to meet with you tomorrow morning to discuss matters of mutual interest. 1100 hours. A car will be waiting for you in front of the hotel." It wasn't a request, it was a summons. "I'll be there," Marcus said. "Excellent. Have a pleasant evening, Mr. Thorne." The line went dead. Marcus replaced the receiver. So, the meeting was set. The next stage of the operation would begin tomorrow. He walked to the vast window and looked down at the city. The lights of Chicago spread out below him like a field of scattered diamonds. From up here, you couldn't see the grit, the poverty, the desperation. You could only see the beauty and the power. He was in the command post now, looking down at the battlefield. He was fed, rested, and properly equipped. He still didn't know the mission objective or the nature of the enemy, but for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Thorne felt like a soldier who was ready for a fight. Marcus slept that night, but it was not the restful sleep of a man at peace. It was the deep, recuperative slumber of a soldier after a long patrol, a necessary shutdown of the system to repair and refuel. He woke before dawn out of long habit, his internal clock impervious to the luxury of his surroundings. For a disorienting moment, he didn't know where he was. The absolute silence, the weight of the fine linens, the faint, clean scent of the air, it was all wrong. He expected the clank of the radiator, the thin grey light of his SRO window, the familiar ache in his bones from the hard floor. He sat up in the enormous bed, the reality of his situation crashing back in on him. He was in the heart of the enemy's territory, a 5-star gilded cage, preparing for a meeting with a woman of mystery and immense power. He swung his legs out of bed and began his morning routine, a ritual that grounded him no matter the environment. He did a series of push-ups and sit-ups on the plush carpet, the physical exertion clearing his mind. He then took another long, hot shower, using the ridiculously expensive soaps, methodically washing away the last lingering traces of the street. He was preparing for an inspection, for a confrontation. His body was his weapon, and it needed to be in peak condition. He dressed with the same meticulous care he had once used to assemble his service rifle. He chose one of the new suits, a dark charcoal grey with a crisp white shirt and a simple conservative silk tie in a deep burgundy. The man in the mirror was still a stranger, but a more familiar one now. The suit felt less like a costume and more like a uniform for this new kind of warfare. It was camouflage, just as Eleanor had said. It allowed him to blend in, to not immediately be dismissed. As he knotted his tie, his movements precise and practiced, he thought about the woman he was about to meet, Eleanor Vance. The name meant nothing to him, but it was clear she was someone who operated at the highest levels. The effortless way she had commanded Arthur, the seamless logistics that had spirited them from a library to a luxury hotel, the casual display of wealth, it all pointed to a level of power he could barely comprehend. And she had been on the street, freezing, huddled in a doorway with 3 other women. Why? It was the central, maddening question. Was it a test? A bizarre social experiment? Had she lost everything and then, in a single phone call, regained it all? None of the scenarios made logical sense. He ordered breakfast from room service, black coffee, toast and eggs, and ate while watching the morning news on the massive television. The lead story was the brutal polar vortex that still held the city in its grip. The news anchor spoke of the city's overflowing shelters and the tragic mounting death toll among the homeless population. The screen showed images of shivering figures huddled over steam grates, the very scenes he had just escaped. A caption at the bottom of the screen read, 14 dead from exposure since Monday. 14. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He thought of the 4 women in that doorway. Without his intervention, that number would have been 18. Whatever game Eleanor Vance was playing, the threat had been real. The cold was a real enemy, and it was still killing people. The thought solidified his resolve. He wasn't just here for himself. He needed answers for them, for the part of him that was still that man on the street. At 10:50, he went down to the lobby. The doorman, who had looked through him the day before, now greeted him with a respectful, "Good morning, Mr. Thorne." The suit was working. The camouflage was effective. The same black town car was waiting at the curb. This time, Arthur was not in it, only the silent driver, who simply nodded as Marcus got into the back. The car pulled away from the hotel and moved into the city's financial district, a canyon of gleaming steel and glass towers where the destinies of millions were decided in quiet boardrooms. The car did not stop at one of the gleaming modern skyscrapers. Instead, it pulled up to an older, more discreet building, a limestone fortress from a bygone era of industry and power. It had no corporate logo, only a set of imposing bronze doors, and the name The Vance Group etched subtly in the stone above. The driver did not get out. The moment the car stopped, the bronze doors were opened from the inside by a uniformed security guard. Marcus stepped out of the car and into a world of old money and absolute authority. The lobby was not flashy like the hotel. It was a cathedral of quiet power. Dark wood paneling, floors of polished marble, and a hushed, reverential silence. The only sound was the soft click of his new leather shoes on the stone. A woman with an earpiece and the severe haircut of a Secret Service agent met him just inside the door. "Mr. Thorne, please follow me. Ms. Vance is expecting you." She led him not to an elevator, but down a long, paneled hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men, the patriarchs of this empire, he presumed. They stopped at a pair of massive oak doors. The woman knocked once, a soft, respectful tap. A voice from within, calm and clear, said, "Enter." The woman opened the door for him and then closed it behind him, leaving him alone with Eleanor Vance. The office was vast, occupying the entire corner of the building. Two walls were composed of enormous windows that looked out over the Chicago River and the city beyond. The furniture was old and elegant, a massive mahogany desk, leather armchairs, and shelves filled with leather-bound books. But the room was dominated by the small, frail-looking woman who now stood to greet him. Eleanor Vance was no longer the ragged beggar from the doorway. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored navy blue dress, a string of pearls at her throat. Her white hair was perfectly coiffed. She looked every inch the matriarch of a dynasty. With her were the other three women. They were also transformed. Amelia, her haunted eyes now clear and focused, wore a smart tweed blazer and held a tablet. Beatrice, no longer stoic and silent, was in a stylish pantsuit, her expression animated as she reviewed a document. And Clara, the youngest, wore a simple dress and looked like a university student, her face clean and bright, the cut on her hand now neatly bandaged. They stood as Eleanor's honor guard, a silent testament to the journey they had all taken. "Mr. Thorne," Eleanor said, her voice the same one he'd heard in the library, clear and commanding. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." She gestured to one of the leather armchairs in front of her desk. Marcus sat, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. He was in a debriefing, a parley with the enemy commander. He would not show weakness. "I believe we owe you an explanation," Eleanor began, resuming her seat behind the massive desk. "First, let me introduce my colleagues properly. This is Dr. Amelia Sterling, our Chief of Research and Development." She gestured to Amelia, who nodded politely. "Beatrice Dubois, our Chief Financial Officer." Beatrice offered a brief professional smile. "And my granddaughter, Clara Vance." Clara gave him a shy but genuine smile of gratitude. "And I am Eleanor Vance, the founder and chairman of the Vance Group." She let the name hang in the air, the Vance Group. It was one of the largest and most powerful private equity firms in the world, a silent, multi-billion-dollar empire with interests in technology, manufacturing, and global logistics. They were kingmakers, a shadowy force that moved markets and shaped industries, and their chairman had been sleeping in a doorway. "Why?" Marcus asked, cutting through the pleasantries. It was the only question that mattered. Eleanor's expression became somber. It was not a game, Mr. Thorne, I assure you. It was an object lesson for my board of directors and for my granddaughter. She looked at Clara, who lowered her gaze. Our company was founded on principles of innovation, efficiency, and a certain degree of ruthless capitalism. In recent years, I have come to believe we have lost our way. We have become insulated, disconnected from the real-world consequences of our financial decisions. We move billions of dollars with the click of a mouse, closing a factory here, laying off 1,000 workers there, without ever seeing the faces of the people we affect. She paused, her eyes distant. I proposed a new initiative, a significant investment in retraining programs and community support for the areas our business decisions impact negatively. A humanity dividend, I called it. The board, a group of men who have never known a day of hardship, dismissed it as sentimental nonsense, bad for the bottom line. So once a year, she continued, her voice hardening, I conduct an audit. I, along with my most trusted executives, divest ourselves of all identification, all money, all connections. For 48 hours, we become the people our decisions create. We become the invisible. We experience the system from the very bottom. It is a reminder of the stakes. It is a reminder of what is real. Her gaze met his, and it was fierce. We have done this for 5 years now. We have been cold, hungry, and ignored. We have been threatened and moved along by police, but we have never been in true danger. Not until this polar vortex. The cold this year was different. It was a killer. We miscalculated. By the time we realized the true danger, our 48-hour protocol was in effect. No contact, no exceptions. We were trapped. We were going to die in that doorway, Mr. Thorne. A quiet, pathetic end for a few of the world's wealthiest women. Marcus listened, his face a stony mask, but inside, his world was tilting. It was a story so audacious, so extreme, it could only be true. It was the act of a brilliant, ruthless, and perhaps slightly mad queen. You came for us, Eleanor said, her voice softening. A man who had nothing. You gave us your food, your shelter, your last dollar. You asked for nothing in return. In you, Mr. Thorne, I saw a quality of character, of honor, that I have not witnessed in a boardroom in 30 years. You are a man of immense value, and the world has discarded you. She leaned forward, her eyes boring into him. I do not believe in charity, Mr. Thorne. I believe in investments, and I believe you are the best investment I have come across in a very long time. The silence that followed Eleanor's declaration was as vast and heavy as the view from her window. Marcus sat perfectly still, processing the words. Investment. The term was cold, clinical, the language of the very system that had chewed him up and spat him out. He felt a familiar bitter taste rise in his throat. He was not a stock to be traded or a commodity to be acquired. He was a man. He had bled for his country. He had held his mother's hand as she died. He had felt the gnawing emptiness of hunger and the soul-crushing invisibility of poverty. These were not assets to be leveraged on a balance sheet. His life was not a line item in her grand corporate strategy. He looked from Eleanor's impassive, regal face to the earnest expressions of the other women. They were waiting for his response, for gratitude, perhaps for him to be overwhelmed by the sudden, shocking reversal of his fortunes. They had no idea of the war that was raging inside him. I'm not for sale, ma'am, he said finally, his voice low and steady, each word carefully chosen. He did not raise his voice. He did not show the anger and humiliation that was churning within him. He simply stated a fact, as immutable as his own name. My honor is not a commodity you can purchase. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed Eleanor's face. She had expected him to be cowed, or at the very least, confused. She had not expected him to meet her power with a quiet, unshakable dignity that refused to be bought. I am not offering to buy your honor, Mr. Thorne, she replied, her tone sharpening slightly, a commander addressing a subordinate who had dared to question an order. I am offering you a position from which to weaponize it. She leaned forward, the intensity in her eyes amplifying. You think this is about you? About rewarding a single good deed? This is much bigger than that. Look out that window. This city, this country, is run by men who see people like you were 2 days ago as nothing more than an acceptable margin of error. I want to give you the resources to fight them, not with a rifle, but with a budget larger than the GDP of a small nation. Beatrice Dubois, the CFO, spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and businesslike. Ms. Vance is not exaggerating, Mr. Thorne. She has established a new independent foundation, the Sentinel Foundation, and has endowed it with an initial capital of $5 billion. She slid a leather-bound portfolio across the desk. It is structured as an irrevocable trust. The board of the Vance Group cannot touch it. Its mandate is to identify and rectify the systemic failures that create the conditions for poverty and desperation, specifically in communities our corporation has negatively impacted. Its director will have full autonomy over the allocation of those funds. Marcus stared at the portfolio but didn't touch it. $5 billion. The number was so large it was meaningless. It was an abstraction. His mother had died because they couldn't afford a few $1,000s for an experimental treatment. The absurdity, the sheer brutal injustice of it was like a physical blow. The director's position comes with a seat on the board of the Vance Group, Amelia Sterling added, her tone softer, more understanding. She seemed to grasp the internal conflict he was experiencing. That is the most crucial part. You would not just be dispensing aid. You would be in the room where the decisions are made. You would have a voice. You would be able to see the plans before the factory is closed, before the pensions are cut. You could force them to see the human cost because you would be sitting at their table. She looked at him, her intelligent eyes pleading. We can give you the data, the financial models, the operational support, but we don't have your perspective. We can't. We can only simulate it for 48 hours. You have lived it. That is a qualification that no university degree or corporate ladder can provide. He looked at each of them in turn. The calculating queen, the sharp-minded financier, the compassionate strategist, the young, hopeful heir. This was a fire team, a highly effective unit, and they wanted to recruit him. They were offering him a command, but it was a command in an army whose values he despised. He would have to wear their uniform, speak their language, live in their world of sterile luxury and abstract numbers. Could he do that without becoming one of them? Could he walk through the mud and not be stained by it? He thought of his room at the SRO, of the men he saw every day with haunted, hopeless eyes, of the promises made to veterans that evaporated into a fog of bureaucracy. He had tried to fight the system from the outside and had failed. He had been crushed by it. They were offering him a chance to fight it from the inside, to become the ghost in their machine. Why me? He asked again. But this time the question was different. It wasn't a rejection, it was a request for the mission parameters. There are thousands of people with stories like mine. Why not one of them? Because they would have taken the money, Eleanor said bluntly. When you stood in that frozen doorway, you had nothing. We were 4 ragged women, a liability. You took us in, risking the only thing you had left, your own shelter. When I gave you that envelope in the library full of cash, you didn't want it. Just now, when I offered you a fortune, your first instinct was to tell me you were not for sale. That, Mr. Thorne, is why it must be you. A man who does not desire wealth is the only man who can be trusted with it. Anyone else would be corrupted or co-opted by the system within a year. The board would eat them alive. They will try to eat you alive. But I suspect they will find you are made of something they cannot digest. He was silent for a full minute, his gaze directed out the window at the city below. He saw it now not as a glittering abstraction, but as a map of human lives. He saw the neighborhoods, the bus routes, the libraries, the shelters, the doorways. He saw the battlefield. He had run from that battlefield in a way. He had accepted his small corner of defeat, maintaining his dignity in a tiny room, fighting a quiet, solitary war. This was an invitation to rejoin the fight on a scale he had never imagined. It terrified him. The responsibility was monstrous. The certainty of failure was high. He would be surrounded by enemies, men with sharp suits and sharper knives who would see him as an obstacle to be removed. And yet, he thought of the 14 dead. He thought of his mother. He thought of the soldier's creed. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Weren't they all the people on those streets his fallen comrades? He slowly brought his gaze back to Eleanor Vance. He looked her directly in the eye, soldier to general. If I do this, he said, and the room seemed to hold its breath, I will not be a figurehead. I will not be your humanity dividend poster boy. This will not be a public relations stunt. I would expect nothing less, Eleanor replied, her voice a low hum of satisfaction. She had won. The authority will be absolute. You will answer to no one but me. I won't run this from an office in a skyscraper, Marcus continued, laying down his terms of engagement. I will be on the ground. My office will be where the problems are. I will choose my own team. I will set my own priorities. Agreed, Eleanor said without hesitation. You are the field commander. We are your supply chain. Marcus stood up. He did not smile. This was not a moment of celebration. It was the acceptance of a heavy, perhaps impossible burden. All right, ma'am, he said, the words feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. I accept the command. For the first time, a genuine, unguarded smile broke through Eleanor Vance's iron composure. It was a smile of pure, triumphant victory. She had found her weapon. She had found her soldier. And she was about to unleash him on a world that had no idea what was coming. The next few weeks were a blur of controlled, high-velocity change. For Marcus, it was like being put through an accelerated officer training program for a war he hadn't known existed. He was a soldier, accustomed to structure and clear chains of command, but the world of corporate power and high finance was a foreign country with a language he didn't speak. Eleanor, however, had provided him with the best interpreters in the world. Beatrice Dubois, the CFO, became his drill instructor in the art of financial warfare. They spent hours in a glass-walled conference room, not in the main Vance Group tower, but in a discreet, unmarked office building Marcus had chosen in a more neutral part of the city. He refused to set up his headquarters in the belly of the beast. Beatrice, with infinite patience, walked him through the labyrinthine structure of the Foundation's $5 billion endowment. She taught him about investment vehicles, derivatives, charitable trusts, and the arcane legal frameworks that govern them. She didn't just show him how to spend the money, she showed him how it could be used as leverage, as a scalpel to excise a problem, or as a hammer to break down a barrier. Money is just a tool, Marcus, she would say, tapping a complex flowchart on a screen. Like a rifle, you have to know how to load it, how to aim it, and when not to shoot. He learned quickly, his mind trained to see patterns and strategic weaknesses, absorbing the information with a grim focus. He wasn't interested in profit margins, he was interested in tactical applications. Amelia Sterling, the head of R&D, became his intelligence officer. Her team of data analysts and researchers could assemble dossiers on any subject with terrifying speed and detail. Marcus would name a problem: veteran homelessness, the lack of vocational training in shuttered factory towns, food deserts in inner-city neighborhoods, and within hours, Amelia would provide him with a comprehensive threat assessment. It would include everything from demographic data and economic analysis to on-the-ground interviews and satellite imagery. She showed him how to see the invisible architecture of a problem, the interconnected systems of policy, economics, and human behavior that created it. We can't just throw money at symptoms, Amelia explained, pointing to a heat map of Chicago that showed a shocking correlation between closed-down health clinics and rising juvenile crime rates. We have to identify the root cause, the critical node. You sever the head of the snake. You don't just trim its tail. Marcus recognized the methodology. It was the same way he would plan an assault on an enemy stronghold, gather intel, identify the command and control center, and then apply overwhelming force at that single critical point. His first official act as director of the Sentinel Foundation was not to sign a multi-million-dollar check. It was to return to his SRO. He walked into the dim, foul-smelling hallway, the scent of stale despair, a jarring contrast to the clean, rarefied air he had been breathing for weeks. He was wearing his new uniform, a simple dark sweater, clean jeans, and good boots, not a suit. He wouldn't make that mistake. He knocked on the door of Mr. Henderson, the hawk-like building manager. The door creaked open, and Henderson's sour face peered out, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion as he saw Marcus. He didn't recognize the well-dressed man for a moment. "Yeah, what do you want?" he grumbled. "I'm here about my room, Mr. Henderson. Unit 313, Marcus said, his voice calm. Henderson's eyes finally registered who he was. "Thorne, I was about to have your stuff thrown out. You're 2 weeks behind on rent." Marcus looked at the man who had been the tyrant of his small, broken world, a gatekeeper of misery. He felt no anger, only a detached sense of pity. "I'm not here to pay the rent, Mr. Henderson," Marcus said. "I'm here to buy the building." The legal and financial transaction was handled with ruthless efficiency by Beatrice's team. Mr. Henderson and the faceless slumlord he worked for were made an offer they couldn't refuse. Within 48 hours, the deed to the building was in the name of a newly created subsidiary of the Sentinel Foundation, his first acquisition, his first beachhead. His second act was to call a meeting of all the building's tenants, a collection of forgotten men, day laborers, disabled veterans, seniors on microscopic pensions, in the now empty manager's office. He stood before them, men with eyes as haunted as his own had been, and he laid out the new rules of engagement. "This building is no longer a rental property," he announced, his voice echoing in the small room. "It's a stepping stone. As of today, no one pays rent. Instead, you will pay into a cooperative fund that will be used for your own benefit. We are going to gut this place and rebuild it, from the plumbing to the roof. You will be the ones to do the work, and you will be paid a fair wage for it. You will learn new skills. We are bringing in counselors for addiction and PTSD and job placement specialists. Your residency here is contingent on your participation. You will help yourself, and you will help the man next to you. This is not a handout. It's a hand up." He looked into their faces, a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and a fragile, flickering ember of hope. He was speaking their language. He was offering them not charity, but a mission. For the first time in years, he saw a glimmer of light in their eyes. This became his model of operation, surgical, ground up, and focused on dignity, not dependence. He didn't build shelters. He bought and renovated dilapidated apartment buildings, turning them into cooperative housing run by the residents themselves. He didn't open soup kitchens. He financed community-owned grocery stores and urban farms in food deserts, providing jobs and healthy food. With every project, he was the point man. He was on the construction sites, in the community meetings, listening to people, treating them not as victims to be saved, but as assets to be empowered. He moved with a quiet intensity that both baffled and impressed Eleanor's corporate circle. They were used to grand gestures, to press conferences and oversized checks. Marcus worked in the shadows. He didn't want his name in the paper. He wanted results. He wanted to see the change in a man's posture when he got his first real paycheck, the hope in a mother's eyes when she could buy fresh vegetables for her children. His presence on the Vance Group board was a quiet earthquake. He would sit in the boardroom, a silent, imposing figure in a simple dark suit, listening to the polished presentations about quarterly earnings and market projections. The other board members, powerful men in finance and industry, initially dismissed him as Eleanor's pet project, a token gesture. They spoke around him, their language a fluid stream of acronyms and jargon designed to exclude and intimidate. They learned quickly that this was a mistake. During a presentation about a plan to automate a factory in Ohio, which would increase profits by 12% but eliminate 1,500 jobs, Marcus spoke for the first time. "What is the plan for the 1,500 families?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through the sterile air of the boardroom. The CEO, a slick man named Peterson, offered a dismissive wave of his hand. "The market adjusts, Mr. Thorne. We'll offer a standard severance package." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the man. "I have the names of all 1,500 workers, Mr. Peterson. I have their pictures, their wives' names, their kids' names. I have their mortgage statements and their medical bills. In 3 months, a quarter of them will face foreclosure. In 6 months, the local suicide rate will triple. I have the data. Before this board votes on your 12% profit increase, I want to show them the faces of the men you are about to destroy. I'll start with John Kowalski, 50 54 years old, 3 kids, a wife with MS. He didn't have to finish. The room was frozen in a shocked, uncomfortable silence. He had changed the calculus. He had taken an abstract number and given it a human face. He had brought the battlefield into the boardroom. The automation plan was quietly shelved for further review. He was making enemies, powerful ones, but he was also, unexpectedly, gaining allies. Young, brilliant analysts and managers within the Vance Group, disillusioned with the soulless pursuit of profit, began to secretly feed him information. Amelia and Beatrice became his fiercest defenders, using their own considerable power to shield him from the political attacks. And Clara, Eleanor's granddaughter, became his shadow. She was his intern, his aide-de-camp, soaking up his philosophy, his quiet, relentless methodology. She saw in him the embodiment of the principles her grandmother had tried to teach her. Eleanor watched it all from a distance, a master chess player watching her gambit unfold. She had not just hired a director for her foundation, she had injected a conscience into the heart of her own empire. She had unleashed a soldier of honor into a world that had none, and he was not just fighting the battles she had sent him to fight. He was changing the very nature of the war. Your support through Super Thanks ensures that the fire of these memories, these stories of quiet courage against impossible odds, will never be extinguished. Thank you for being a keeper of the flame.